Audio Jungle.
25 years ago, my mom chopped all my hair off. I was 8 years old, and my head was riddled with lice. It's the logical thing to do, my mother told me while casually snipping away all of my curls. The easiest way to get rid of them all. Sitting on a low stool in our bathroom, I couldn't see my reflection. I was smiling, optimistic that this new hairstyle would suit me. But when the cutting stopped and I stood up to look in the mirror, a horrified stranger stared back at me. I was almost bald and not at all pretty. All my girliness lay limp at my feet. Not too long after that haircut, and in the heat of the Cape Townian summer, I started to wear my raincoat to school, with its hood drawn low over my head. And I continued to wear it every day for 6 long months, determined to hide this ugly little girl that I was convinced I'd become. It wasn't until earlier this year that I realized why that haircut was such a big deal. From the age of 4, I was sexually abused by a trusted friend of our family. And as best as I can remember, that molestation stopped around the same age that my mom cut my hair. I must not have been pretty enough for him anymore, or girly enough, or perhaps I looked older and so no longer to his taste. But at 8 years old, I couldn't rationalize any of that. I didn't know the word for pedophile or predator. All I knew was that this man, who had always treated me as though I was special, who had always paid me so much attention, he wasn't interested anymore. He stopped wanting to spend time with me. He stopped even acknowledging me. And he never explained why. Seeing that haircut for what it was made me realize something significant. The shame I experienced as a result of my abuse was twofold. On the one hand, there was the shameful act itself. Although rationally I was far too young to be able to know, even name what was happening to me, instinctually I knew it was something bad. What made it so shameful was that even at 4 years old, our bodies are already wired to experience sexual pleasure. And I reasoned that if I felt good doing something I knew to be bad, then surely that meant I was bad too. The second manifestation of shame came when my mom cut my hair and the abuse suddenly stopped. I'd come to see my abuser's behavior as a sign that he cared about me. And when that behavior changed, I took it to mean that I was no longer worthy of his attention. So I hid under my hood and I cut myself off from the world. And the resultant isolation only affirmed my growing belief that I deserved to be alone, that I deserved to be without love. The shame of my abuse, coupled with the shame of just being discarded by the man abusing me, shaped my belief that I was not enough. And since the age of 12, when I told my parents what happened to me, I have been fighting to dismantle that belief. I was exceptionally lucky to have access to psychotherapy, and even luckier to have parents and a brother that protected and supported me throughout my healing process, seldom letting their own pain compound mine. Being able to unpack my trauma while I was still a teenager and then fall into the reliable arms of my family is the foundation upon which my recovery is based. Photography strengthened that foundation. Getting strangers to trust me enough to take their photograph, I've really had to practice empathy. And when you step enough times into the shoes of those you don't know, wearing your own shoes with a little more love and kindness naturally seems to follow. Photography was the first hat I wore that made me believe I could be good at something, that I was more than just a victim. And that was a profound turning point for me in my fight against shame. In 2016, nearly 2 decades after sorting through my abuse and its aftermath, I decided to confront the man who abused me, the man responsible for all my shame, the man to whom it in fact belongs. I spent months preparing for that meeting, rehearsing all the things that I would say to him, the stuff I would get off my chest. I planned to yell at him, to tell him what a monster he was and how the memory of him sickened me. But the day came that I sat across from him in my therapist's room, and I found myself completely mute, totally incapable of expressing the rage and the sorrow that simmered just below my calm and collected exterior. Instead of having my say, I sat and listened dutifully to his own story of childhood abuse, his own story of self-loathing and self-harm. Instead of giving my shame back to him, I left that encounter having absorbed all of his. Months of depression followed. My next big attempt at casting off shame came last year, when I invited fellow survivors of sexual trauma to speak up, to let me take their portrait and record their story, and if they were ready, to share those stories with the public. 11 exceptional women did step forward, and together we hit shame square in the face by transforming our trauma from an isolating act into one that connected us. It was beautiful, unifying, cathartic. It also almost destroyed me. Once the project was complete and out there for the world to see, I went down a dangerous road with red wine, white wine, pink wine, all the wine. I refused to let my friends, my family, and my partner in on my pain. I recreated the isolation that followed that childhood haircut and became the girl under the hood once more. Why? Why was my shame so intent on following me throughout my life, so persistent and adaptable? I'd hid it with all of the weapons that I could think of. I'd been to countless therapy sessions. I'd confronted the man who molested me in a real effort to forgive him. I connected to other survivors, casting off secrecy and the stubborn belief that I would always be alone. So why did I still feel this inescapable sickness inside of me? In a word, vulnerability. Alongside honesty and human connection, shame's greatest enemy is our willingness to accept that we as individuals are vulnerable. We are flawed, prone to fail, and deeply sensitive to the many hurts that we suffer along life's timeline. Acknowledging and embracing this vulnerability, it's hard for everyone. It's particularly difficult if you are trying to shed the label of victim, which so many survivors of sexual trauma strive to do. For most of my life, I equated vulnerability with victimhood. And by drawing that connection, I never wanted to give my vulnerability the proper space in which to express itself. While confronting a sexual predator, the man who had violated my young body, I was the picture of togetherness. I did not yell at him as I so badly needed to do. I did not cry. I did not even lash out and defend my 4-year-old self when he told me the reason he started molesting me was because I smelled nice. I sat there and listened to his issues, discussed his reasons for doing what he did, as if I was his therapist, as if I was the grown-up and he was the child. I attempted to practice the same level of what I construed to be emotional togetherness throughout the Me Too project last year. each woman's story, each portrait that I took, opened deep and painful wounds for me. But instead of sharing that resurrected pain, instead of trying to unpack and understand it, I just drank my way through it, determined to be the courageous storyteller that people on social media were telling me I was. In both instances of trying to tackle my shame, I pretended not to be vulnerable, not a victim, but a survivor. While confronting the man who molested me, I suppressed my rage. While connecting to women who shared my experience, I disconnected through alcohol. And that is precisely why my shame persisted. Because its power lies in confining its subject to the prison of invulnerability. It wasn't until this year, when I realized why that haircut was so significant, that I truly saw and understood the nature of shame. Like the mythical Greek monster Cerberus, who quite fittingly tries to prevent the dead from leaving the underworld, shame is a three-headed beast. It strives on secrecy, on the isolation that it creates, and on this belief that as survivors, we are not allowed to be vulnerable because if we are vulnerable, then we are perpetuating our own victimhood. The trick I've learned to slaying this beast, or at least fighting it into submission, is to strike all three heads at once. First head, secrecy. To overcome secrecy, I must continue to share my experience of trauma. Emphasis on continue. If there's one thing that years of psychotherapy have taught me, it's that Pandora's box is never completely emptied. It's always filling up with new pain, new secrets, new things that threaten to shame me. The endlessness of this is an exhausting thought, but accepting it as a given has helped me to keep my lid open, to make sharing a part of my everyday life rather than something I reserve solely for my overburdened therapist. Second head, isolation. To fight off isolation, I must connect to other survivors, which sadly is not hard to do. Take a moment to consider all of the women in this room. 1 in 3 of us is a survivor of sexually based violence. 1 in 3. That is a disturbing realization to make for so many reasons. One of which is that it means my story isn't special. And even in the context of trauma, it is quite normal to want to feel special. But being 1 in 3 does not minimize my experience. It does not make my pain any less important or worthy of expression. On the contrary, holding hands with other survivors only makes my story more powerful. The 33.3333%, it's a mighty strong army. And connecting to it has been my greatest defense against the shame-induced belief that I deserve to be alone. Invulnerability is the last of the 3 heads, and it is perhaps the most important because if we can't beat this one, then secrecy and isolation will just continue to regrow. To combat this idea that vulnerability is victimhood, I have to be in constant conversation with myself, listening to and responding kindly to my particular set of sensitivities, rather than trying to squash or run away from them. While sharing my story and embracing the stories of others, I have to acknowledge the vulnerability that this level of connecting involves, that it in fact demands. I'm not suggesting that to beat shame, we should go and cry on the shoulder of whoever is standing closest to us. I doubt the lady in the dairy aisle would appreciate that, as kind and compassionate as she might look. a well-constructed set of protective armor is important. I certainly had to put on mine before stepping out here today, or I would not have been able to string 2 coherent sentences together. But the armor needs to come off. And it needs to come off with those who can hold us, in spaces that can hold us. I am here sharing my story, and afterwards I might connect to those of you who have had similar experiences. But if I don't acknowledge just how vulnerable I am doing these things, how exposed I feel out here, how sweaty and socially anxious I can get talking to strangers, and how easily triggered I am by the sexual trauma of other women, then I run the very real risk of inviting depression back into my life. I am a survivor, but I am a sensitive survivor with anxieties and mood swings to match. So, in a few days, when all of this has sunk in, I'm going to make weepy calls to my mom. I'm going to anxiously replay every moment of this talk to my loving husband, ask him if I'm a total loser, and try my best to believe him when he tells me that I'm not. And instead of wishing away the inevitable emotional exhaustion that will follow, I will take the opportunity to sleep. Of course, shame will fight me the whole way. Shame will tell me that I most certainly am a loser, that I'm a weakling for crying to my mom, and lazy for needing to rest. Shame will tell me to drink a bottle or 2 of wine, buck up, put on a fat smile, and show everyone just how happy I am. But the voice I am listening to more and more these days is the one that says, it's okay to collapse. It's okay to rest and be anxious, to cry and be sad. To be vulnerable is not to be a victim, and none of us have to keep hiding under that hood. Thank you.